Hello again everyone and welcome back. Today I'm going to be just going through part D, I think it's part D of the GCSE psychology course for Edexcel 9 to 1. You can find it on the Edexcel website. I'm just going through some notes for you that I made when I was doing the GCSE. God, that was hellish. So hopefully this will help you, because I know that there's limited resources out there. So start off with areas of the brain. So there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6 areas of the brain that you really need to start to worry about or concentrate on, and these are the cerebellum here, there's the temporal lobe around here, frontal lobe here, the parietal lobe here, and the occipital lobe here, and then you've got brainstem there. Now the brainstem there is the bit which connects to the spinal cord and goes all the way down the back. Okay, now this applies to both hemispheres of the brain. So if you imagine that your brain is like if you make two fists and you put them together, so this applies as much on the left hemisphere of the brain as well as on the right hemisphere of the brain. So it's the same on the other side. So there's a left frontal lobe and a right frontal lobe, left parietal, right parietal, and so forth. So here are what they each do. So the occipital lobe, it interprets visual information, so all the visual information goes to your occipital lobe. Your parietal lobe takes on sensory information, and so the parietal lobe is that top one up here, the yellow one. The frontal lobe is for decision making and problem solving. That'll become significant in a bit. The temporal lobe is for interpreting sounds, including language. So that's the one at the bottom here, that's the temporal lobe. Cerebellum is about movement, coordination and balance. And the brainstem connects the brain to the spinal cord. So that's the brainstem there. And the limbic system is in the centre of the brain, so when you made two fists and put them together, your thumbs are the limbic systems. And actually you will have, well, you have two limbic systems basically. You have a left amygdala and a right amygdala. You have a left hippocampus and a right hippocampus, for example. So you do actually have two of the limbic system. So it's not just like they have one in the middle of the brain, it's like you have two. So these are neurons. So you only need to have a basic coverage of neurons for the GCSE course. You just need to understand a few things like what a neurotransmitter is, what a dendrite is, what the cell body is, what the axon is, and what the axon terminal is. You need to know the basic parts and how it goes through. You need to be able to label a neuron. You don't need to know about the Schwann cell bit or the myelin. Well, you need to know it's myelin, but you don't need to know where the myelin is. You need to know that you don't need to know a node of Ranvier. You just need to know axon, axon terminal, nucleus, dendrite. And this is how neurotransmission works. So a neuron will receive a neurotransmitter in a specific receptor. So receptors are like these, well, if you've done enzymes in biology, if you imagine that an enzyme has a lock and key mechanism, it's kind of similar for receptors. So basically it's like a lock for a key that is a neurotransmitter. So a neurotransmitter goes into a receptor, and a receptor is always a specific shape for the neurotransmitter. So the neurotransmitter is received at a specific receptor at the dendrite. So the dendrite is the bit up the top, and then this signal and the neurotransmitter always gives a specific signal. It gives a specific command. So for example, dopamine is a reward. I think dopamine is a reward neurotransmitter. So basically the electric impulse which will be sent along the neuron will be basically saying, hey, we need rewards now, and then they'll just go down the axon and they'll be basically moved forward by the myelin helps it to move forward, and then it'll reach the axon terminal, and at the axon terminal specific neurotransmitters can then be sent from the synapse. That should say the synapses are the synapses are the specific sort of gap. What they're actually sent from are things called vesicles. I'll try and write it out for you if I can do. Is there something that's going to come up at the side for me? No? Okay. Pointer options. Pen. Yeah, okay, so vesicles. Excuse my handwriting. So vesicles. So you will have vesicles in the axon terminal, and these will eventually release out specific neurotransmitters to go across the synaptic gap, or you can call it the synapse or synaptic gap. As well, what you should notice is that once it's been received at the dendrite, then a neurotransmitter is always undergoes what's called reuptake. It's basically recycled. So it's that's the best way to explain it. It's just recycled so that the brain can use it again. This also takes it out of the synaptic gap, so it takes out of the space in between two neurons, which we'll come on to way later when we go on to depression. I'm talking about depression because it's important then. But for now, just understand that neurotransmitters are recycled. So this is Damasio. So Damasio et al. Was a case study done in 1994. Now this, if you are new to the psychology course, this is the way in which you always present a name of a study. So you always present it as the main researcher and then et al. Usually, if there's so many researchers, it just means and anyone else who helped. Although sometimes with studies like, I think it's called, what is it? It's called Mednick, Gabrielli and Hutchins is one you might do later on, and that one has several names in it, so it varies, but basically you just lay it out as names and then date. Anyway, this is Damasio, 1994. So it's a case study, and that's an in-depth study of one individual or one specific scenario. You can have case studies about, like, I don't know, like a specific shooting or a specific school possibly, but basically it's always an in-depth study, and it uses a variety of sources, so it uses a variety of ways of testing the the independent variable. Independent variable. So variety of sources used. So that's what it means. Holistic. You don't need to worry about what holistic means at all for now. So the aim was to use neuroimaging to understand where in the frontal lobe Phineas Gage had been hit in 1848. So some context here. So Phineas Gage was a railway worker, and he was basically tamping some dynamite, I think it was, with a tamping rod into a hole, and basically it just exploded, and the tamping rod went through his head. Unfortunately, he survived, but he was noticed to be more aggressive after the accident. There's plenty of videos on it. I'll actually put one up in the corner just so you can go and have a look and just learn about Phineas Gage, because the context is kind of important. So the procedure, now why would they want to understand where he was exactly hit? Well, the idea is that if someone, like we've just learned that the frontal lobe is involved in decision making, right, and personality a little bit. So supposedly, if you're hit in a specific place in the frontal lobe, it'll affect the behaviours that that specific place controls, such as if you were maybe, I don't know, the tamping rod went through the cerebellum, you'd just fall over and you'd probably not be able to work your motor coordination anymore. You know, I would be surprised if it went through the cerebellum though, and it didn't go through the limbic system, because the limbic system is really important. Anyway, that's aside from the point. The point is that if Phineas Gage was hit through the frontal lobe in a specific place, that specific place might have significance for, like, decision making and personality and blah blah blah. So that's why they wanted to understand where he was hit. So there were x-rays used, so x-rays on his skull. His skull was exhumed with the permission of family, I believe it was, and then the X-rays were used on the skull, and 3D imaging was used, and this is something else called telluric coordinates. Now, telluric coordinates are basically a way of doing 3D imaging. They basically just map out where in the brain something is, and 20 possible entry points were then determined for where Phineas Gage was struck by the tamping rod, and this is narrowed down with sources from the time, from doctors, from peers, from things like that, from people like that. All of the damage was in the frontal lobe, so it shows that it is about decision making, it is about personality. And Broca's area, which is an area for language, it's in the temporal lobe. It's a smaller area in the temporal lobe, and it went undamaged, so he could still speak. Motor cortices were undamaged, so he could still walk and, do all the physical things he needed to do. But it was the ventromedial area of the frontal lobe which actually was hit, and this was backed up on research, with research on monkeys with low serotonin in that area, and they were aggressive too, in a similar way that Phineas Gage was. So that's basically backing up the point. It adds some reliability to it. Now, when we evaluate a study, now this is going to be fun. When we evaluate a study, evaluating Damasio et al., now you need to know what reliable, objective, valid, generalizable, useful applications, and ethical all means. So these are the 6 sort of, I suppose you'd call them barometers, we use to actually measure how good a study is. So I'll go through them each by each. So reliable, so that means generally how much you can repeat a study and it actually gives you the same results time and time again. So if you tested it again, will it have the same results? And you can be more certain of this if you've used more participants, if you've used the same procedure on all of those participants. Of course, this doesn't matter because it's Phineas Gage. There's one person. I seem to have put PG as dead. I'm unsure why that is. If anyone can give me any ideas why I might have put that at the time, then please tell me. So this is why I've written other examples. So monkeys were used. So that's more participants effectively, and it backs up with the reliability, because the more participants you use, the more sure you can be that if you did a similar thing next time, you get similar results. Okay. Might be that you can't get reliability out of Phineas Gage because he's dead, so he might not count as participant. I don't know, something like that. Objectivity, aggression is subjective, and this is especially true when we're looking at records from the time. Nowadays, whenever psychologists actually want to measure aggression, they create their own aggression scale, which is far from perfect, always is, but it's still better than trying to write down, these personal interpretations of why Phineas was aggressive, or personal interpretations of how he's aggressive. Now, objectivity and subjectivity are opposites. Objectivity means you can't dispute it. That's the facts, that's the numbers, that's the stats. Subjectivity is where you can kind of dispute it and dispute what it means. So the thing is that there's something else I haven't mentioned, is that telluric coordinates, for example, they're a way of using 3D imaging. You get exact numbers for where Phineas was hit through the head. So that is objective, and because it's what's called quantitative data. Quantitative data is where you have numbers. Qualitative data is where you have descriptions or stuff that isn't numbers. So the 3D coordinates, they're objective because they're quantitative, but aggression and descriptions of aggression from the time are subjective because they're qualitative, is a general good rule. Validity. Now, validity is, you can sometimes just write validity brackets truthfulness in exams because they kind of mean the same things. It means how true are the results of the study and why. You will come on to different types of validity. So, for example, ecological validity. There are other types like internal validity, blah, 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 which we will look at later possibly. So, for example, uses sources from the time, presumably ecologically valid. Now, ecologically valid means it's true in a real-world setting. So it's true outside of a lab. So a big gripe of a lot of psychology studies is that someone, might not act like that in real life, and that's what makes something not ecologically valid. When something is ecologically valid, people would act like that, and people would be like that and that aggressive in the real world, and we know that because Phineas Gage, all of the records about him were from interacting with him in the real world in the 19th century. It's also not subject to demand characteristics. Demand characteristics is something else you should know. Demand characteristics means that a participant is acting the way they think the researchers want them to act. So you might say be doing a study where people have to write a paragraph on how aggressive they are, just an example of a study, and that would be really subject to demand characteristics because, if you told people we want to research how aggressive you are, then someone might, write out, oh, I'm really aggressive, blah, 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 because I do this, this, and this, and they might lie a bit. Don't say lie in your exam. But that's demand characteristics. It's doing what you think the researcher wants you to do. And this is a thing about Phineas Gage being dead and also using monkeys. You don't get demand characteristics. It's generalizable. Not very. It's a really rare injury. I don't think people have rods going through their heads that often nowadays, honestly. Useful applications. I should probably explain what generalizable means first. Sorry. Generalizable just means, can you apply it to most people in the world? How many people can you actually apply it to in the real world outside of a lab? So this becomes a problem when you look at studies like that look at, say, aggression or obedience or really social problems, and you have to account for people will have been raised in certain cultures, and that makes something less generalizable, for example, because it doesn't apply to the whole human race. A good word for talking about this is target population. So, for example, if you want to research aggression in humans, then your target population is the whole of humanity, because that's the population you want to research overall. Generalizability is when you don't meet that target population at all. So if you're researching the whole human race, like we want to research how aggressive humans are, but then you only, say, take participants from, say, Kettering, then that is really not generalizable at all. Useful applications. So useful applications, it does what it says on the tin. If you can use it in the real world and if it will give you something to do with it, then that's fantastic. Brilliant. Can be used to treat frontal lobe problems. Yeah, I think we come on to another frontal lobe problem at some point, but yeah, definitely, that's a useful application. It can be used to treat frontal lobe problems. Ethical. How ethical is it? The 12 who were also referred to... yes. There were 12 people who had similar injuries, and they also showed similar aggression as well. So there were 12 patients who Damasio referred to, and they had... a similar injury to Phineas Gage, and they had similar behaviours too. So that also backs up the reliability because it's more participants. They may have had impaired decision making, because if you think about what the frontal lobe does, it's your decision making tool. So if your decision making is impaired, can you actually give consent? No, you can't. That's one of the factors that makes something ethical in psychology. If you can give consent, great, that's a step towards it being ethical. If you can't give consent, that makes it more unethical. There's other things too, like were people harmed in the procedure? The procedure is another way of saying what you do in the study. Are the people anonymous? So can the people be kept anonymous? Do we not know their names? Can we make sure that we don't know who they ever were? There's a few others as well. I think we'll go through them at a later point, but just for now, I'll pick up on them when they come up. So that was Damasio et al. This is about brain lateralization. So the brain, as I've said, has two hemispheres, the left hemisphere. So if I draw out you a nice little brain, so it's as if you're sort of looking at yourself from the top down and your eyes are at the top. So your left hemisphere is the one that basically, if you held your left hand above your head, then on the left side, then you would be on your left hemisphere. Your right hemisphere is when you hold your right hand on your head on the right side, and that's your right hemisphere basically. That's a good indication. It's not like it swaps around or anything. That is, those are the hemispheres. So the left hemisphere deals with language production. So if you're talking, you're probably using your left hemisphere. It deals with logic. It deals with mathematics. It also, for some reason, deals with right side control and the right visual field. So when you wave your right arm, it's actually your left hemisphere that's working. Your right hemisphere, as well, deals with all of your left side controls. So that's your left visual field and your left side control. So if you wave your left arm, you're actually using your right hemisphere. It also deals with facial recognition and music and creativity and intuition and insight. So that basically means your gut feelings and your ability to see into things and think, oh, maybe this is like this. Like, it's the sort of skills you use when doing English Lit, if that makes sense. There was a study on this called Sperry et al., and this is another one of your key studies. That's something I should mention, by the way. If I ever do 2 slides on a study and go into a lot of detail, it's because they're what's called key studies. So these are studies you can be specifically asked on in your exam, and we'll go through an example of an exam in a bit, and you'll see what I mean. You will look at other studies, but they're not key studies. You can't be specifically asked about them. You can only use them as just bits and bobs to throw in there as, you know, to spice up your writing. But the key studies are the ones you absolutely have to know. So, Sperry et al., 1968. So, the aim. So the aim, as I said, as you hopefully have figured out anyway, is what they wanted to research. So the aim was to explore behavioural changes in those with split corpus callosums. Right, so this needs explaining. So if you know what a corpus callosum is, that's great. Now, if you imagine that you have your left hemisphere and your right hemisphere, you must be thinking, how do they communicate? Well, there's a great bundle of nerves between them called the corpus callosum, and basically that, I suppose it's a bundle of nerves, and it basically communicates between the two and makes sure that they get along. Now, ages ago, like 60 odd years ago now, cutting that corpus callosum used to be used as a treatment for epilepsy. So basically, if you had epilepsy, you could get that cut, and I think it was used for schizophrenia as well, but I'll have to look that up. Correct me in the comments if I'm wrong. Basically, they had these two split, and there were some very weird outcomes. The outcomes I will actually send you, well, I'll show you. There should be a little card coming up in the corner, hopefully, on a CGP Grey video about it. That's really interesting. So the aim was to explore the behavioural changes in those with split corpus callosums, because if you imagine, if someone has their left and right hemispheres, split from each other, then there's going to be really interesting results. And this is something that a psychologist might want to research. So the procedure, there were 11 participants. That's a kind of smallish number, but to be fair, it is a rare illness. Right, now this is something that you're going to have to imagine. So you're going to have to imagine that you have a wow, this is going to be so imagine you have a massive screen in front of you, and imagine it's sort of split in two halves, and one half says one word and the other says another. So for example, key on the left side and case on the right side. So they both flash up at the same time, but key is on the left side and case is on the right side. So then you have to pick out objects, and you have to say what they are. Now consider that this requires some clever thinking actually to predict what will happen, but basically if you consider that the left hemisphere is the one which controls language, which hemisphere controls right side vision, that's the left hemisphere again, which one is going to be said, key or case? So the hands would go into bags, so your left and right hand would go into a bag, and then the participants would have to say what was picked out without looking at them. So because if you look at them, then it means that you engage both visual fields, because you have your left visual field and your right visual field, which is why you lose something if you close one of your eyes. So if you think about it, about where language is controlled, and you think about which hand is controlled by which hemisphere, you should be able to figure out which hand they could talk about and which hand they couldn't talk about. So a maths problem was flashed in the left visual field, so it would go into the right hemisphere, and a rude image was also popped into the left visual field, so it would go into the right hemisphere. So the findings here were when you had so I'll go through what actually happened. So people could only say case. Now that's because the right visual field is controlled by the left hemisphere, so it goes in the left hemisphere, and when a person has to say it, then they see case and they say case, but they can't say key because the right hemisphere doesn't do language. Okay, so key would go in the right hemisphere, but they couldn't say it. Hands going into bag, so they could only say what was in their right hand, of course, because what's in their right hand, the left hemisphere would figure it out, and the left hemisphere controls language, so the left hemisphere would be able to say it. So for the left hand, that information would go to the right hemisphere, but the right hemisphere can't talk, basically, so they wouldn't say it. This is a single participant, but you're trying to think of it as if it's two persons. I get it, it's confusing. Please go back and replay it again if you need more explanation. So, what else? Yes, so they found that the right hand was under left hemisphere control and right visual field under left hemisphere control, and vice versa. Yes, so the maths problem was flashed in the left visual field. Even though we think now that the left hemisphere controls maths and logic, it turns out that the right hemisphere can actually do basic maths problems. And the right hemisphere can also trigger reactions to things. So it can do maths problems, like, you know, the one flashed into the left visual field, basic maths problems, and it can trigger a reaction to the rude image. So, but when the person was asked why they responded the way they could, then the person couldn't explain why, because the response came from the right hemisphere, and the right hemisphere can't tell the left hemisphere about what happened. So the left hemisphere just has to guess why they responded that way, why the brain responded that way, or effectively it's two brains. So the conclusion Sperry made is that certain functions are lateralised, as we saw in the previous slide. So we've got left hemisphere, language, logic, mathematics, etc., etc., and right, facial recognition, music, creativity, etc., etc. So here's our evaluation of Sperry et al. So is it reliable? Like, there's 11 people used, so that's kind of, I mean, it's a low, it is a small sample, to be fair, but the same point was repeated. So for example, they kept testing whether the person could speak using the right hemisphere or speak through the right hemisphere, if you get what I mean. They kept testing that, so for example, the whole key and case one, the hands go in bag, they have to say what was picked in left and right hand, and the rude image, and explaining why they giggled at the rude image. This was all tested again and again and again. That increases the reliability, sorry, because you keep on testing it, so it's more likely to be, the results are more likely to be repeated later on, or you know, you can be more certain that the same results will come out. Yeah, also there was a standardized procedure, which basically means that all of the participants did the same thing. So objectivity, so this is basically how clear cut it is, how, you know, up to personal view it is. So you either can or you can't say something or do something or write something or, giggle, for example. It's definitive and objective, although except for rudeness or giggling. So the rudeness or giggling, that's subjective. So why someone was giggling is still subjective. Even if you asked, why were you giggling, and they gave an answer, you can't exactly say what they said is a wrong answer because you're not them, if that makes sense. So it's subjective, that. So validity is low ecological validity. It was done in a lab, and do you think that normally in daily life you will go around and having key and case flashed into your eyeballs? No, you won't. So that's not ecologically valid because it's not something that happens in real life, and so it can't be true to real life. It can't be something that will apply to real life, that will be true outside of a lab. Generalizability, so how well it applies to the target population. So it's an uncommon condition, really, really uncommon, although that's what they wanted to research. So arguably it's good generalizability because their target population was those with split corpus callosums. So maybe it was quite generalizable. But the thing is that does it have useful applications? It's useful in understanding lateralization and then being able to diagnose things like when someone goes mute maybe, or someone possibly, can't do maths problems as well. You'd be able to diagnose that in the left hemisphere, for example. For ethics, there's a possibility of impairment to consent. If the two hemispheres can't communicate, how can we be sure that the person happily said, yes, I want to do this study, and, did it with their full conscience? Because one of the parts of consent that's important in psychology is what's called informed consent. So a person has to be informed when they consent. They have to be able to say, yes, I understand this, and yes, I give consent. I'm allowing myself to take part in this study. Is that possible when someone has a split corpus callosum? Right, okay. So these are three conditions you also need to know about. Prosopagnosia, prefrontal cortex damage, and visual agnosia. So your teacher might talk about, for visual agnosia, I'm sorry. They might talk about The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. That's a book by Oliver Sacks, who was a neurologist. So you might get read a bit of that, possibly, if you're lucky. But let's go through what each of them are. So prosopagnosia, it's also known as face blindness. It's something which Stephen Fry actually has. It's an inability to recognise faces, so you can't actually... So you look at people, and if you imagine how difficult it is to look at a fingerprint, for example, and differentiate between them, then you have that same thing for faces. You just sort of look at them and think, no, those are all the same. So you might try to use, if you have prosopagnosia, you might try to use clothing or the hair colour or the speech to recognise faces. So if you need to recognise someone, then you'll use what they're wearing or what they're saying or how they're speaking to actually recognise them. And it's linked to an area called the fusiform gyrus. Remember that one, fusiform gyrus. So there are two terms that you need to know as well, developmental versus acquired. So developmental is where you've grown up with a condition, and acquired is where you've developed it after an injury. So you could hypothetically develop prosopagnosia because you've developed it after an injury, or you could have grown up with it, which is also possible. Visual agnosia is the inability to recognise a whole object, only its parts. So, for example, if I held up a pen, you wouldn't recognise it as a pen. You might just say, like, it's a cylinder, or something like, it's a grey cylindery thing with a red top, with a sort of bar at the side of it thing. Maybe. And this is the inability to recognise a whole object, and you can only sort of put its parts together and say that's what it is. And it's usually caused by damage to the occipital lobe, because the occipital lobe, again, processes visual information. Prefrontal cortex damage is where you've damaged your prefrontal cortex, which is in your frontal lobe, and it's often a result of collision, so it's acquired, and it will cause mood swings, aggression, and impaired judgment. None of these can actually be treated with medicine, they just have to be treated with being a nice person, basically. And you just have to cope with it for the most part, and you can hope that, say, prefrontal cortex damage will heal, but, you know, it's difficult. Okay, so this is a... wow. Ooh. So this is the bit that I don't think anyone really enjoys, although you might enjoy it. It's basically a key question. Now, a key question is something that you really need to be able to answer and understand. It's about how has research in biological psychology developed over time. I'll find it and I will actually put it below because it has more specific wording than that, but I've just put it as biological psychology because basically you need to understand how technology has impacted biological psychology over time. So a study we're going to take as an example is RAIN, which was done in 1997. So the reason that I can remember that is because it was when Blair was elected, so that's how I remember it. And they studied the neurophysiology of criminals with PET scanner, which detects glucose. So if you haven't done a PET scanner yet, basically what RAIN did is the person, I think they, maybe they were injected with a radioactive tracker that released radiation. Did it release radiation? Well, it released radioactive particles, and this tracker has similar behaviours to glucose. So basically, it's not that harmful to humans. So it just gets injected, it goes into the brain, and basically you can watch in a PET scanner which areas are using it and which areas aren't. And RAIN did this on criminals, and Clements did it as well to show how their activity worked. And RAIN found that people who had committed murder had reduced activity in the prefrontal cortex. So that's again to do with decision making. Case studies are still needed, as the BPS, so that's the British Psychological Society, sees it as unethical to cause harm. Now, causing harm, or you need to protect your participants from harm in a study. So, of course, you can't cause the harm at all. So, for example, if we wanted to research damage to the frontal lobe, we'd have to take patients who already exist. We couldn't just bash someone in the frontal lobe and then study them, because that would be unethical. It would be causing harm. So case studies are still needed. And again, if you remember what case studies are, it's an in-depth study of one individual or one situation, and the BPS, so the BPS sees it as unethical to cause harm, so that's why we still need case studies. Damasio, Damasio, if you remember, 1994, used Telerex coordinates, so that's the 3D imaging. They used X-rays, etc., etc. And technology, you'll be asked about technology probably, has allowed biological psychology to have quantitative rather than qualitative data attached to it, because a lot of the so this makes it more objective, because if you remember, quantitative numbers, you can't argue with numbers. Qualitative, it's like written records, and you can kind of argue with written, sort of paragraphs, for example. Like, oh, Phineas Gage came into the pub today and he threw a glass on the floor and started shouting like a madman. Like, that you can it's kind of subjective as to what that means. So you can that's qualitative data. Technology throughout time, so X-rays, the 3D imaging, and the PET scanners, it's allowed biological psychology to have quantitative data, and that means it's more objective. And that means that when you research Phineas Gage, you're not just sort of trying to rely on records from 200 odd years ago, you're actually looking at, oh, here, let's put his skull in a 3D imaging. 3D imager? Yeah, whatever. So These are gender differences. Now, I don't know why gender differences are actually in the biological section. Well, I kind of do, because we presume that gender can be biological. So gender can be biological, but it can be social. You might be asked about this. Women take more humanities and men take more STEM. So women generally take subjects like English Lit, history, sociology, philosophy, and men generally take more STEM subjects like biology, physics, chemistry, and maths. And the only sort of exceptions to this actually are for, I think it's psychology. Yeah, actually for psychology. So psychology, there is a place where even if it is a science which is disputable, women take it more than men. Summa, in 2004, they found no difference in male and female hemisphere functions. Harasti, by contrast, 7 years earlier, same year as Rain, found that left hemisphere areas for language were 20% larger in female than males, and Clements et al. And is another study which used a PET scanner, and it's women may not, women are able to use bilateral function, so that's when both of the parts of the hemispheres, both hemispheres are going. So women are able to use bilateral function for more logic-based tasks, whilst men may not. Okay, so the next bit would be memory, but I think that we've gone on for... So we're going to just quickly go through an example of an exam paper you could get on GCSE psychology for these sorts of things. And this is the exact diagram which I got for my PowerPoint. It's just not coloured in. So here it is. So figure 1 shows an image of the human brain with 2 areas labelled. These are easy questions, so let's see. Where is area X? What does area X do? So does it do balance, interpreting auditory information, planning, or sensory perception? Try and have a go now. Okay, if you said that it does planning and organisation, then you are correct. Identify one function of area Y of the brain. So what is area Y? It's the occipital lobe. What does the occipital lobe do? Does it do consciousness, emotions, interpreting visual information, or language processing? Again, if you said C, you're correct. Define what is meant by prosopagnosia. In this, you just need to make 2 separate points. So, for example, you could say prosopagnosia, also known as face blindness, is where a person cannot distinguish between the faces of people. So, they may use hair colour or speech or other features to distinguish people rather than using faces. That gives 2 separate points. It tells you what prosopagnosia actually is, so people not being able to distinguish faces, and what a symptom might be. Alcohol is a drug that affects the central nervous system and influences human behaviour. Simon drinks alcohol and experiences some pleasurable feelings but also some negative effects. Explain using synaptic functioning why Simon may be experiencing different feelings from the effects of alcohol. Right, so this is something that A-level students might be able to answer better than GCSE students, I have to admit, because it doesn't feature heavily explicitly. You just kind of get thrown in the deep end. At least that's what I felt. So, is a drug that affects the central nervous system and influences human behaviour. So, this is difficult. So, central nervous system influences human behaviour, drinks alcohol, synaptic functioning. So what did we learn about the synapses? So you get a neurotransmitter and it attaches to a receptor. So for example, you could say that alcohol might fit into a receptor and give a different message to a neuron, which would be sent as an electrical impulse, which would alter the activity of the brain. Or you could say alcohol might interrupt reuptake of a neurotransmitter and mean that this neurotransmitter stays in the synaptic gap for longer, and so it has more of an effect, and so it will be more aggressive, effectively. So you can choose those two. Basically, it attaches to a receptor, or it stops reuptake. So Willow is studying the role of hemispheres of the brain. Now this is a stats and methods question, but if you want to have a go at it, you can. Task 1, damage to the right hemisphere, damage to the left hemisphere. Now what you don't want to do with one conclusion is you don't want to effectively jump too much. So you don't want to just give the conclusion, you need to explain why. So for example, you might want to say, don't try and choose 2. I know that it's 2 marker, but the 2 comes from one statistic and explaining why that means a conclusion. So for example, the right hemisphere must handle emotions and recognizing emotions, because damage to the right hemisphere resulted in a 13% ability to identify emotional expressions, compared to 86% for the left hemisphere for the damage to the left hemisphere. And that would possibly get 2 marks. I honestly was not great at these sorts of questions, but oh well, we carry on. Explain the findings of Willow's study. You should refer to Sperry 1968 in your answer. These are bugger questions. Right, so Sperry 1968. So what do you know about Sperry 1968? So suggesting synonyms for a given word. So you might want to synonym, same meaning as a given word, synonyms for a given word. Right, okay, so you might want to reference how the left hemisphere controls language, as shown by the fact that when shown 2 words, one in the right visual field and one in the left, only the word in the right visual field could be said, which shows that the left hemisphere, which controls the right visual field and language, which controls the right visual field, also controls language. And similarly, the participants with damage to the left hemisphere could only suggest 2 synonyms, which means that they also have damaged abilities with the language, possibly, if you want to call it that. Their ability to use language is impaired. Explain one way that Willow could improve her study of the role of the hemispheres. This is always a tricky question, so tell you what, I will go to the mark scheme and be very lazy and see what the mark scheme says. Section B, C, and D. Greater number, variety of brain damage patients. So there's 1 mark for an identification of a relevant improvement. So basically, say what the problem is and how you'd improve it and why. Oh, she only used 2 participants. Yes. Okay, yeah, you always want to look at as many details as you can. So, for example, how many participants are used? So, 2 brain damage patients. Yeah, okay. I should have noticed that, really. Right. Theto investigates sex differences in activity of the hemispheres of the brain. Oh, great. This is always fun. Right, okay. So we'll work with this. He times how long it takes participants to complete a verbal task and a spatial task. Explain 2 findings from Theto's results. You must use theory concepts about sex differences in hemispheric function. So, for example, wow, okay. You might want to find the mean for a few of these. So, for example, the mean of these and the mean of these. So, for example, spatial tasks. So, spatial tasks to the right hemisphere. So, finding 1. If we quickly go and have a look, Bilateral function for more logic-based tasks, whilst men may not. 20% larger. Ah, yes, okay, so women are, so yeah, you would want to find the average, and you'd want to find the average of that, but basically once you'd found the averages, you could say something like, for example, males struggle more with the spatial task, possibly because the males would not use I don't know, both hemispheres for spatial tasks, or males would not be able to cope with spatial tasks because males predominantly use the left hemisphere rather than the right, or something like this, or the left hemisphere of a male is bigger than the right hemisphere of a female, or something along those lines. Because there are certain preconceived ideas. Let's have a look at the answers, see what they say, because they'll probably say something better than I've said. Oh, right. Huh? Oh. Right, that's the paper 2. Sorry, I'm just randomly scrolling through, aren't I? Sex differences in language processing in the left hemisphere. Right hemispheric dominated processes, whereas women tend to be less lateralized. Okay, that's a good thing to know. Women tend to be less lateralized than men because they can, if you remember, they can use both hemispheres for language tasks, for example. Sex differences in language processing in the left hemisphere. Yeah, that's very, I mean, I'd call that a cop-out answer. I mean, it's true, but it doesn't, it doesn't say anything specific. But anyway, sex differences it's not very specific, but oh well, that's what the mark scheme says. So I hope that you have learnt something today, even if I've just been rambling on. And I hope that I will see you all soon for another video about psychology. I will go through the memory topic next, which I believe is section B of paper 1. Okay, thank you all. See you later. Bye.